Hello my friends, stay a while and listen. It's Q here from RetroQ Gaming and I want to take you back in time. And despite going so far back in time, there was still things that we have to this day very prevalent, mainly the console wars, something that has existed through generation to generation of console over the years. From new companies rising to old companies fading into obscurity. From vicious ad campaigns to the weirdest of celebrity endorsements. From Mode 7 to blast processing, we are going to take a look through the years at the console wars. We're going to see how they played out on this side of the world, and how I persevered, how I survived, and what side I chose, and how that played out for me. Over the next couple of videos, we'll see how all this went. But for now, let's take a look at the 7th generation of consoles. Now, fear not for those of you who have watched the previous video, the 7th generation of consoles is actually nowhere near as innovative, interesting, or revolutionary as the previous generation. Like I said in the last video, the 6th generation of consoles is what I would consider the last truly innovative and truly great console generation, which is why there was so much to talk about. Unfortunately, that's not so much the case for the 7th generation. By comparison, a lot of it is far more mundane. Having said all that, let's go with the rest of this generational video. As always, I want to preface this by saying this is taken from a European perspective, from release dates and whatnot. It's especially important to note in this one because there's actually a fairly large discrepancy in release dates for one of these consoles. So you North American viewers out there might find this very different. So there were 3 major players in this console generation because naturally Sega had pulled out of the hardware market after the, let's call it, extremely disappointing sales figures of the Sega Dreamcast. But we had Microsoft with the Xbox 360 coming in off the relative success of their first foray into the console market with the OG Xbox, back when they came in 2nd place of 4, beating out industry veterans like Sega and Nintendo to come in 2nd place of the console generation, despite it being their first actual attempt. We had Sony with the PlayStation 3, looking to do for this generation what they did for the previous 2, that is win those generations essentially. And Nintendo with the Wii. Now there's a lot to be said about the Wii, which we'll try capitalize on later on in this video, but first off, let's go and look at the actual consoles and we'll go through them one by one. So first up, because we're going chronologically speaking, we're going to go with the Xbox 360. Now depending on what way you look at it, there's so much that can actually be said about the Xbox 360. From the first proper high definition console, I say the first proper one because we all know with how enhanced definition and 480p and questionable resolutions and stuff of the previous generation, but this was the first proper console that had proper HD output, even if some of that was only 720p, or even 1080i, or even to an extent later in the game, 1080p. But everyone knows the Xbox 360, they know that big white beast, or depending on how you know it later on in the generation, the little black beast. The Xbox 360 of course has had multiple different generation refreshes, adding things like bigger hard drives, HDMI ports, built-in Wi-Fi, smaller unit, and different aesthetical designs. But overall the functionality has remained completely the same, as you'd expect. Now when it comes to the Xbox 360, this is something I mentioned previously in the last video, the 6th generation. The architecture of both of these consoles, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, because the Wii was its own whole separate deal, they were both very different. Now they were technically both PowerPC architecture, and the Xbox 360 technically was inferior in power, at least from the CPU side of it. The CPU of the Xbox 360 was considerably easier to use than the custom cell processor of the PlayStation 3. I'm not going to get super into detail and depth and whatnot of all the technical details here because it's not really the point. What you need to know as a consumer and what we needed to know as gamers back then was 1, it was easier to develop games for the Xbox 360. And 2, because of that, most companies, not all, but most companies would use the Xbox 360 as a lead development platform. This was a very important thing, because when it came to the PlayStation 3 versions of most games, again, not all, the Xbox 360 versions usually either ran better, looked better, or both. There are of course notable exceptions like say Final Fantasy XIII, LA Noire, and a few others as well. These games were developed primarily for the PlayStation and imported to the Xbox, but the vast majority of games were developed the other way around, primarily on the Xbox. Some of these games famously were absolute trash on the PlayStation 3. Mass Effect 2 was nigh unplayable in certain areas, certain important areas at that, and we all know the legacy of Bayonetta on PlayStation 3. A game that's lucky to break out of the teens in frame rate. But really, that's it when it comes to the hardware. That's more than we need to talk about. We will spend a little bit now in a minute just talking about the peripherals, but after that, we're going to go on to the important stuff, the actual games. Now, when it comes to peripherals for the Xbox 360, again, there's not much huge or innovative here. There's only one or two, actually I think three in particular, is all that we need to talk about. One of which is Xbox Kinect. Microsoft obviously improving on standard camera technology and incorporating like motion tracking, gesture control, things like that. It was a nice niche little kind of toy, if you will, a nice little experience, a little foray into the whole deal. It was even very, very popular at launch. I know I bought one day one and I barely used it. The few times I did use it, it was pretty fun, but it just felt kind of unwieldy and, well, pointless for the most part. I played a bit of Child of Eden, played a decent amount of Fruit Ninja Connect with a friend, and that's pretty much the extent of my Xbox Kinect. After that we have the Smart Glass app. This was back when basically every game and every platform had to have its own individual companion app. Microsoft obviously had Smart Glass to try incorporate all of them into one big app, or at least as many of them as possible. I've made videos on this before, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, since it is technically still supported on the current version of the consoles of the Xbox One, but no one ever uses it. It's basically dead from a development standpoint, but it still works. So thankfully that fad has died out. There's also the HD DVD drive for the Xbox 360. Because the PlayStation 3 actually supported native Blu-rays, and this was when the format war, or the high definition format war, was just starting out, Microsoft opted for the HD DVD drive as an external accessory because they'd only had a standard DVD drive built inside it. Now, funny enough, when it comes to the HD DVD drive, I was looking at the actual formats back in the day when this was all going on. I actually backed HD DVD, still have about 50 of them upstairs, and I have 2 HD DVD drives just because I want to be able to watch the films on them, or at least I want the ability to watch them should I ever decide to do so. I still have my standard working HD DVD drive, and I even picked up a brand new one on clearance for €10 at one point, which I still haven't opened just in case my main one dies. But anyway, back to the important thing, the games and the console itself. So Xbox 360. Here in Europe, the Xbox 360 had a considerable lead over the rest of the other platform. They had a 1-year launch lead ahead of the Wii, and they actually had a 1.5-year launch lead on the PlayStation 3. Many of you out there are actually probably thinking, but wait a minute, Q, it launched about a year. The PlayStation 3 launched about a year after the Xbox 360. Well, it was actually delayed significantly here in Europe, and it didn't launch until the middle of 2007, whereas the Xbox launched at the end of 2005. And throughout that 1.5 years, it had pretty much cemented itself for most people as the go-to platform. The launch lineup wasn't the greatest thing in the world. I remember playing a shitload of Perfect Dark Zero when a friend of mine's brother got his Xbox for Christmas. He didn't get one, I didn't get one, but his brother got one. His brother wasn't really massively into too many games at the time, but we made use of it, even if he didn't. I still remember days where we'd stay up all night playing Perfect Dark Zero co-op on the hardest difficulty, trying to complete it entirely. I'd be sitting in his house from like 9 PM till about 7 AM, and if we were lucky, we'd get maybe 2 levels done. Dark Agent was a bitch. And this is the kind of thing that actually repeated itself throughout the entire console generation, or at least throughout the entire console generation in regards to the Xbox 360. Back then, Xbox Live wasn't huge, and online multiplayers on consoles and stuff wasn't really massive around these parts, but over time, over the next couple of months and years and whatnot, everyone else started getting in on it. Naturally, I had been in on it since the previous generation, as I already mentioned, but finally, my friends were getting in on it. And we had that community, the community that we knew and loved every day. We could now play all the games we love together online much easier. And that was a big deal. And that sense of community and that ability to do so together just went throughout the entire generation. You can look at all the different games probably every few months for almost every year the console was out, and there was always something we were playing together. From big name games like Halo 3 to some smaller niche titles. And with the advent of Xbox Live Arcade and what they could offer through that from download, the choice was absolutely massive. Not to mention when they ported stuff like Final Fantasy XI to Xbox 360, and even came out with some new ones at the time like Phantasy Star Universe. Granted, that was also on PC and PS2, but for me, that hit big on the Xbox 360. And even from the start of the early generation, you had games like Call of Duty 2, not to mention the landmark title of Modern Warfare, and pretty much every Call of Duty after it. There was always something to play, always something new, hot, and current that we could play together. coupled with the actual ability to use party chats across multiple different games, where I could want to maybe play a single player game that day, but my friends were online, I wanted to talk to them, and maybe they were all playing Battlefield together. I could jump into a party chat with them, I could play my game, they could play theirs, and we could talk. That was a big feature that was an advantage over any of the other platforms. But anyway, let's round out the Xbox 360 portion of this video with another little anecdote, because that's apparently what I do. So one of the ones for the Xbox 360 that pops to mind when I talk about it in a funny little way is I remember way back in the day, I want to say at the end of 2008 is my approximate guess, there was a leaked demo of Resident Evil 5 published on the internet. This demo was not supposed to be publicly available anywhere, but it had been ripped and put on the internet somehow. And what you could actually do is you could download this game. For some reason, you couldn't download it to a DVD. If you downloaded and burned it to a DVD and put it in your console, it wouldn't read for some reason. Trust me, I've tried it several times. But you could actually download it and put it onto a CD, that's right, an old school CD, and put it into the disc drive, and it would actually play. Because it was on a CD, the load times were horrendous. It was only 2 small areas of the game, but it was still brand new and cool because we all knew Resident Evil 5 was coming out. And of course, I'm a big Resident Evil 5 guy. At least now I know I am. So it just felt fairly fitting. And while we're on the topic of Resident Evil 5 actually, and little anecdotes, fun fact, when the first Resident Evil 5 DLC, The Lost in Nightmares, released on the Xbox 360, for about 2 weeks, I was number 1 in the world on those leaderboards. I remember spamming it over and over and over again because it was so damn good and I enjoyed it so much, and I got such a high score in my first run that I managed to work my way up to get to number 1 in the world on the leaderboard. It of course was all score based, and there was always one guy that was in number 2. It was some German guy, and what would happen was we'd frequently be basically online the whole night trying to outdo each other. He'd beat my score by like 100, I'd beat his score by like 100, then he'd beat mine by 100 and I'd beat his by, and we'd ever so slightly get that little bit. Eventually I figured out how to get a huge bonus right at the end of the DLC, which shot me like 1500 points ahead. And for the best part of about 2 weeks, no one could come close and touch it. Now, the big problem there is after those 2 weeks, I was still number 1, but I went on holiday to the US for 2 weeks. I came back and I was like 40,000 in the world. Apparently a bunch of other people had figured out lots of other ways to get big bonuses and big boosts throughout the entire DLC, which would all add up and completely dwarf my score. At that point, I never bothered even trying to get back to the top. It was just something I wasn't interested at that point. Funny little anecdotes because, well, that's what we do. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. The Nintendo Wii. And we're doing this one because European release date. Released a year after the Xbox 360 here in Europe, the Nintendo Wii was very different from what everyone expected. It was considerably underpowered compared to the rest of the consoles. It was only standard definition. You could get a little bit of 480p out of it with component cables. But it was significantly underpowered. You didn't have a proper style controller unless you went out and bought an additional extra, which wasn't really supported by everything else. And how everyone knows the Wii and what everyone knows the Wii for? Well, waggle, waggle, waggle motion controls. Now of course they wanted a big killer app to sell this with at the time, so naturally they did a dual simultaneous launch of Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess on both the GameCube and on the Wii, as well as packed in stuff like Wii Sports. Now don't get me wrong, as much as I dislike motion controls, Wii Sports was hella fun for so many years. But the big problem with the Wii was that it was marketed towards the casual audience. Now I realize the casual audience makes up the biggest part of gaming consumers, but I don't look at it that way. I don't care if a business or a company is doing exceptional if they have nothing to offer me. And that was a big problem with the Wii. Now, I can skip a lot of stuff when it comes to talking about the Wii because so much of it is inconsequential, except for very few things. Like for example, it was severely underpowered, so it could not run the equivalent, even cut down versions of games on other platforms, so they got huge amounts of shovelware, just like the Switch. It can't play these games and it just gets a huge amount of old ports and shovelware. But one of the actual truly important things to talk about when it came to the Wii is the advent of the Virtual Console, a concept which Nintendo basically pioneered to make available a large portion of all their previous platforms, as well as some competitor ones, digitally available to download through their console. This would of course continue on with the Wii U and even the 3DS models, but would eventually be killed and got rid of when it came to the Switch. And the Virtual Console, while it started off extremely poorly, it actually went extremely well eventually. Now all that time did take about 2 years for it to fully, truly blow up, but it did eventually get there. And despite the serious amount of shovelware and the lack of third-party support in their high-end games, of course, as you'd expect from a Nintendo platform, there were some very, very high-quality Nintendo games. There were even some very, very high-quality non-Nintendo games on the platform too. I've already mentioned Twilight Princess. Later in the generation we had Skyward Sword, Super Mario Galaxy, Super Mario Galaxy 2, Xenoblade Chronicles, and that's just but to name a few. So as you'd expect, there was some very, very high quality titles on there. However, for hardcore gamers, there was very, very little appeal of the Wii, outside maybe 1 or 2 games a year. I know I went for large periods, I'm talking probably spaces of up to a year if not more, of not even turning on my Wii. And even then when I did, usually it was only because of the backwards compatibility on the GameCube. Because the hardware of the Wii was actually a copy of the hardware in the GameCube, just running at a higher clock speed, it could run GameCube games flawlessly. So with built-in controller ports and built-in memory card ports and actual disc support, all of which was removed on later revisions by the way, was a very attractive package to me. Backwards compatibility is always great no matter the platform, as long as you don't have to pay for it because then it's not true backwards compatibility. But despite some horrendous graphics, terrible gameplay mechanics and controls, because of waggle waggle, the Wii still went on to technically win the generation. It sold over 100 million units, which is more than either of the two rivals. But again, I'm looking at this from my perspective. Now when it comes to anecdotes for the Wii and ending out this part, I actually don't have much to say because, like I said earlier, my use of my Wii was so infrequent that there was basically nothing to do with it. Actually, now that I think about it, because of my such infrequent use of my Wii, I can actually use that as a story. On earlier models of the Wii, I mentioned that there was GameCube controller ports and GameCube memory card ports. These were covered by a flap, just a hard plastic flap that would click into place. Now I very, very rarely open or close these. Usually I would actually leave them just open and have stuff plugged into them the whole time. So I'd say I actually had them open for maybe about 4 years in a row without ever touching them even once. And the funny thing about that is when I did eventually go to move my Wii, I found that somehow these flaps were actually broken, so it became kind of a meme of broken from misuse instead of broken from overuse. Usually things break when you use them too much. They don't typically break when you literally don't use them. Now you could put that down to unlucky or faulty hardware or whatever, but pretty much every single person I knew had the same problem, which is why it basically became a meme and breaking from lack of use. But anyway, that's that for the Nintendo Wii. Let's move on to the last one, the PlayStation 3. Now, like I mentioned, the PlayStation 3 released last of the 3 consoles here in Europe because it suffered a number of delays, including one that put it 6 months after America and launching in that region. As I already covered in the Xbox 360 part of this video, we've already talked about the architecture and the difficulty of developing games for the PlayStation 3. In fact, many people don't remember this, but Activision actually publicly announced that because of the difficulty of developing for PlayStation 3, as well as the very poor sales numbers that their games were getting on the PlayStation 3, they actually considered pulling Call of Duty as an entire series away from the PlayStation. Could you imagine that? Imagine a world where Call of Duty would not be on PlayStation consoles. Now I realize they probably would have came back when they saw everything doing better and PlayStation 4 doing what it is, but that might have not been the case. People might not have bought PS4 if they couldn't have got Call of Duty on it. That of course remains to be seen, but back then that was a very, very large concern. Some of the other problems with the PlayStation 3 were apparent from day one as well. Not just the development cycles and the development costs and difficulty, but it actually launched with a very significant price tag. The PlayStation 3 launched at €620. And there were a number of gambles that Sony actually took on this, all of which of course are positive. Just like in the previous generation with the PlayStation 2, they actually went to do this with the PS3 to give everybody the option of a low-cost Blu-ray player into their home. This was at a time when Blu-ray was brand new. Dedicated standalone Blu-ray players were anywhere between €1,000 and €2,000. By comparison, you could buy a PlayStation 3 for €620, get a relatively affordable Blu-ray player as well as a next generation games console. So that did pay off in many regards. One of my favourite things about the launch models of the PS3 is because of the difficulty of programming and different architecture and whatnot from, say, the PlayStation 2. In order to ensure 100% perfect backwards compatibility, early models of the PS3 actually launched with a PS2, a physical PS2 hardware built inside it. So you could put in a PlayStation 1 disc, it would run perfectly like it would on a PS2, with a digital output of HDMI because of the PS3. You could also put in a PS2 game and do the exact same thing. I even have a little official Sony add-on that works as a memory card reader. I can put in my PS1 and PS2 memory cards and play games directly from there, or copy them to the virtual memory cards on the internal hard drive of a PS3. Now, unfortunately, eventually this functionality was actually removed to an extent, because they did remove the actual hardware, the PS1 and 2 hardware, from later revisions of the console. Eventually they patched in PS1 software emulation, which runs pretty damn well, but PS2 is nowhere to be found. Now, I've already mentioned in this video how the majority of games were developed for the Xbox 360, therefore either running inferior, looking inferior, or both on the PlayStation 3 the majority of the time. So there's not much I can say about the PlayStation 3 in that regard, simply because all I ever bought on it was exclusive games. Now, had I known at the time that Final Fantasy XIII and LA Noire were actually originally developed for the PS3, and actually ran and looked better on those platforms than, say, the Xbox 360, I would have bought the handful of multi-platform games on the PS3, at least if they were games I had planned on buying. But that sort of information wasn't widely readily available at the time until a bit later. So pretty much everything I own on the PS3 is actually just an exclusive game. Now, having said that though, there are obviously some very, very high quality games on the PS3. Many people will point to the likes of God of War, Heavy Rain, which is personally a game I love, it was my game of the year for 2010, and The Last of Us. It's another big one that a lot of people will praise. So it still did have a significant amount of high quality games out there for many people, even if the multi-platform games would run worse or look worse or both. In fact, it got to the point where Xbox was killing Sony so much throughout the majority of the console generation. Xbox got the whole dude bro image, that everyone who wants to buy FIFA buys an Xbox. Everyone who wants to go online, all the dude bros, and play their Madden and their Call of Duty and whatnot, will buy an Xbox. When you think about it logically, whoever's winning the console generation is the dude bro console. I can guarantee you all those dude bros of the previous generation are now on the PlayStation 4, doing the exact same thing. Playing their FIFA, playing their Call of Duty, playing their Madden with their fellow dude bros. But despite all of this, both the Xbox and the PlayStation went on to sell over 80 million units each, none of them beating the Wii. And at the very end of the generation, the PlayStation 3 actually overtook the Xbox 360 in sales, only by about 3 million units. But still, at the end of the day, it did happen. It's very strange to me that it did, because the PlayStation 3 was lacking a lot of features in regards to the Xbox 360. Party chat being one of the main ones. Party chat was something that was asked for years on the PlayStation 3. It turned out it was physically impossible to do. It was an absolute hardware limitation, and that was an absolute killer in comparison to the competition for a lot of people. The ability to hang out in a party, talk with your friends no matter what anyone was playing, it's a very attractive social prospect for a lot of people. Stuff like that even continues on into nowadays, just like the previous generation, where you would typically buy games that were on a platform your friends were buying it on, because you could all play it together. If it was very hard to play together, communicate and whatnot, that could easily turn people off it. I don't really have much of an anecdote for my PS3, but I'll give two small ones anyway, just for the sake of it. I actually got my PS3 2 days before launch, because back in the day when it was launching, we actually were selling them where I was working. We sold a Sony line of basically everything, including PlayStations. Funny enough, we didn't actually sell games. So I got my PlayStation 2 days before launch, and I had absolutely nothing to play on it. I did have a Blu-ray because I bought it in anticipation, so at least it gave me something to watch, until launch day and I could actually pick up a game. My other anecdote would actually come a couple of years later, because my launch PS3, the one I mentioned a second ago, actually broke just out of warranty. It broke about a year and 2 weeks after I bought it, which was out of warranty. At that point, Sony had stopped repairing or refurbishing or doing anything outside of warranty for people, because they just wanted you to buy one of the updated, refreshed model. I said, fuck it, I'm not going to bother at this point. I'm going to wait a few years until an actual game I want comes out, and then I'll buy a PS3 again. That was looking like it was going to be heavy rain before I bought my next one, but it actually turned out to be a lot sooner. At one point I actually went up to GameStop. I remember this one because I was actually on crutches at the time, and there was a sale on in GameStop. Now usually the GameStop sales at the time were fairly poor, but there was this game that was in there that I had always seen and always wanted to try out. But again, I didn't have a PS3 because my old one broke, but I always wanted to play it and planned on buying it once I got a new one. Now this game was always full priced. It was always like 65, 70 euro, whatever it was. This game of course was Valkyria Chronicles 1. But it was on sale this day. It was on sale for like 15 euro, possibly 20. So that was a significant discount. And they also had a sale on PlayStation. There was something like 80 or 100 euro off a PS3. So I'm thinking, hang on, you know what, fuck it, I'm gonna buy these now, because this will work out as a sale and a benefit for me. Anyway, you can imagine me carrying a huge bag with a PS3 and game on crutches all the way to the opposite end of the town and then trying to set that bastard up. Luckily I did, because Valkyria Chronicles is an amazing game, and the rest is history. So here we are closing out the end of the 7th console generation video. Ended up a little bit longer than I originally expected, but nowhere near what I was afraid it would end near. So when it comes to the 7th console generation, how did I survive it, what happened, and how did that work for me? Well, you've probably picked up on it over the course of this entire video. Between the Xbox 360 and the PS3, because the Wii was out of the picture for that kind of stuff for a hardcore gamer, it had to be the Xbox 360 for me. Between coming out early, having some extremely high quality exclusives, the majority of games looking and playing better on Xbox 360 versus PS3, the ability to play easily and chat easily with all my friends, the Xbox 360 easily became the console of choice to surviving that generation. As a comparison, I have over 100 Xbox 360 games and somewhere between 40 and 50 PS3 games. The PS3 ones, of course, are all exclusive games, except maybe like 2 of them. The Wii is its whole other separate little deal, still had a couple of really high quality games, but I can easily say the Xbox 360 gave me thousands, if not tens of thousands of hours of enjoyment. I find it very hard to think of a period where I didn't have at least one gaming session a day on Xbox 360 over 5, 6, 7 years. And because of the party chat and the selection of games and quality of games that were on there, it was always there with my friend, something that I couldn't have done on any other platform. Anyway, that's it for surviving the 7th console generation here in Europe. Probably very different from what you guys over in America experienced, but who knows, everyone is different. For the next video and final one in the series, we'll move on to the 8th console generation, which is actually the current console generation. We'll see how I survived that one, but as always, I want to thank everyone for watching, listening to tales of how I survived console generations here in Europe, and how they're different from maybe someone else's experience, both in the same region or somewhere completely different. So I'll see you guys on the next video to find out how I survived the 8th console generation.